relatively easier for us to trace the land pollution compared to the air one. So like each state literally have so many industries sent up. So how did they really guess which pollution was coming like from which state and who was responsible for what?
Yeah, I mean, I also haven't looked at all of that in a great detail, but from what I know, from the knowledge, the little that I know, so for example, let's say that tar sand, which is one of the one type of a fuel, right? It's one type of non-renewable resource, which is close to coal, and it's present in certain areas. So let's say it's present in abundance in Canada, and we know that tar produces more SOxes than a traditional coal, right? For example, like
Yeah.
just giving you an example. Now, let's say that right next to Canada is, or maybe that's not a great example, but let's say this is between New Zealand and Australia, right? So let's say New Zealand has a lot of these resources and Australia doesn't. And the pollution that's found in that air sampling is more, like let's say we do air sampling and we see that the concentration is polluted there. And then you do it at certain intervals. So remember, when we spoke about monitoring air or monitoring generally the environmental quality, we spoke about observations from the satellites and observations on the grounds. So a very basic thing would be, for example, for me to sit in Lahore and see how many factories do we have here versus how many factories do we have in Faisalabad. And if I am in the EPA, I say that Faisalabad has more factories, so automatically it's using more coal. Or I just look at the BP sales or any other data, and then I guess that Faisalabad is producing more. That's one, right? The second is that you actually sample the air around it, above the city, as well as around the city. You properly sample the air, and then you get to know what's in it. And you can get an idea of how much pollution is present above a certain area. Now you're talking about transboundary pollution, you're talking about its movement. So how do you expect, for example, the question that Nadia had with reference to ozone hole? How did the ozone or the chlorofluorocarbons end up being above the Antarctic region, right? It was because it was able to travel, it's highly reactive, but how did it ever make it there? Was it because the chlorofluorocarbons was it because our development took that chlorofluorocarbon to that area? Or was it the chlorofluorocarbon itself that was able to travel? Was it able to travel from one city to another? Or was it able to directly travel? So if it is long range, it means we expect that it would have gone to a farther area. So when I said it's highly reactive, and I said that it reacts with one ozone molecule after the other in the stratosphere, maybe it is a very, very, very long range and long life gas that is present there, right? And I think that's the problem with chlorofluorocarbons being sent to the atmosphere, that it's, once you send it there, it's going to stay there for many, many years. And even though we have stopped producing CFCs on troposphere, at least all of it is, I think, being banned, it's still present in the stratosphere. And it's present in the stratosphere because it's highly reactive, as well as it has a longer life, as well as it is able to travel long range. But to like put it short, there's no one way to monitor it. No, it could be as simple as looking at the utilization and sale of fuels, or use of renewable and non-renewable fuels, to properly looking at satellite data and seeing where a particular pollutant is dominant. Or simply taking air samples. So let's say you just send airbags everywhere and take proper air samples and sample it and see how far, for example, a pollution from Lahore has reached, especially if it's reaching from a polluted city to a site that is pristine, to a site where there's no industrialization. Then definitely it's easier to trace it. But in any case, air pollution monitoring is, I think, way harder than many other forms of pollution monitoring.
Got it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Miss,
Yes.
may I add to this, because my presentation is going to be about transboundary air pollution.
So how about I now open the floor to you guys, because I don't want to randomly discuss something. So Hassan, I think you were the first group anyway, right?
Right, yes.
And you're presenting yourself, or is someone else from your group presenting?
I'll present myself. If my other members would like to join, that's fine, but I can present it.
Okay, but I would highly encourage for people who generally do not speak in the class to speak, right? Okay, so I will share should I share the slide, or do you just remember the order and the topics that I gave you?
The first one was transformed, so
okay, go ahead. Hassan, you go ahead and then I can share the slides, that's fine.
Right, so the first question would be, what is long-range transboundary air pollution? Like the name suggests, it's basically pollution that travels to other areas and causes some sort of bad effect or some some adverse effect to human health, right? The other part of the definition was something that was just discussed right now. And the thing about transboundary air pollution is that it is really hard to track. So it specifically targets pollution that does not have like a very accurate source. It can't be distinguished. One way to estimate is to use something like weather patterns, right? So the idea is that the entire country or like a city or something is responsible rather than a single industry or like a single company or a factory. So long-range transboundary air pollution was one of the Geneva Conventions, and the aim was to limit the discharge of such pollutants and for those that are part of this to cooperate with each other. Initially, it started out as just trying to limit sulfur dioxide, but later on they added NOx, volatile organic compounds, heavy metals, eutrophication, and ground level ozone. It had a total of 8 protocols, the last one being the Gothenburg Protocol, which was in 1999. So the policies for this convention were that the parties involved agree to develop and research on trying to reduce emissions and also to monitor them. And whatever they monitor should also be something that is discussed among the countries that are involved, the parties that are involved. And that was one of the key things about the convention, that exchange of information was supposed to be completely freely available. So any monitoring data, any new technology developments, any new policies or strategies that were being implemented. And they were supposed to annually meet and discuss any of these developments that had happened in like the past year. That was the basic idea.
Okay, super. Group 2. Who was room 2, yeah? Come on. Okay, sorry. So who was discussing Basel Convention? Maybe people who are discussing Basel Convention can. Nobody?
I would say at least repeat the member list so that we can like recall who is our group member, who was our group member.
Azhan, what was your topic? This is very disappointing, guys. What was your topic? I think yours was, wasn't it the prevention? It was either ozone or one of the hazardous wastes one.
I mean, it was the fourth one, the Montreal Protocol.
Montreal Protocol. Okay. Who wants to discuss that? Again, the same people. I think I suggested that people who generally do not speak in the class should speak in this class. But it's okay, Nadia, you can go ahead and then I will.
Ma'am, we have Montreal Convention. So like, I think we have group 4. But I don't remember the group number, but the topic was Montreal Convention.
Okay, talk about it.
Like, I'm not supposed to talk about this. I like maybe Shayad Ikra or someone else is going to present it. But I didn't prepare anything because
Okay,
she said
Ikra,
she will do it.
Ikra, where are you?
Ma'am, right now I have no notes right now, but Nadia had noted, so maybe Nadia will please help.
Ma'am, could you just repeat the name of group member? I'm
It
totally
was
lost.
you, Nadia, and Ikra, and somebody else who was looking at this.
It was Azan, Ikra, Daniel, and I was there.
Is anyone going to discuss it, or should I go to the next topic?
I think I was supposed to talk about it.
Okay, go
Yeah.
ahead.
So the topic that we were given was the Montreal Protocol for the protection of ozone layer. So as we all know that the depletion of ozone layer is a global problem. So in respect with regards to its causes and effects, so we all are responsible for the depletion of ozone layer as well as we all are affected by this depletion. So an agreement was signed between 196 nations worldwide to mitigate the substances that are responsible for this depletion. And it was signed in 1986, 1987, I guess. The agreement has been so far very successful because according to sources, the stratospheric ozone layer level will soon recover to the level that was in 1980s between 2050 and 2070. So moreover, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has estimated that the Americans that are born after 1987 will are expected to avoid the risk of getting skin cancer by 40. The estimated statistics were for 43 million of people will be able to avoid skin cancer cases, and 2.3 million skin cancer deaths can be avoided if this in addition to other the environmental benefits of the ozone layer, if this Montreal Protocol is fully implemented. Yeah.
Okay. Fateh, आपका group क्या देख रहा था? And who's supposed to talk from your group?
My group topic was the trail smelter arbitration. And in my group, we all selected myself to speak. So should I begin?
Yes, go ahead.
Yep. Before we get on to the case itself, Trail is basically a town on the Canadian-American border, like really on the border. And a Canadian a smelting company, it established a mill in that town and to smelt them and to make metal things from them. Now, thing is that the operations of the smelting mill in Canada was was releasing harmful gases, m- particularly sulfur dioxide, which was affecting crops and forests on the American side. So now this caused a small dispute between the American farmers and hunters on the American side and the Canadian corporation on the other. Even though it was eventually the corporation which won, this case is still quite important, especially in regards to international law and environmental law. Um, Chiefly because it introduces this principle of polluter pays. For those that don't know, there is a there is a branch of law known as tort law, in which there is this principle that a person can do whatever he wants on his or her land, provided whatever he is doing is not a nuisance to his neighbors. And in this case, the and in this case, the Canadian the mill the smelting mill owners, their actions were causing some damage to the to the farmers and hunters on the American side, they were uh, they were uh, they were not making a proper use of their land, and they were harming it. And therefore, this polluters pays principle, under which the corporation would have, or state would have to pay damages to those who have suffered. And what makes this case important is that this particular legal principle was for the first time in international was for the first time introduced in international law.
Yes, exactly. So the reason why I shared the Lac Lanu and the Trail Smelter arbitration were exactly because at that time these conventions did not exist. So there weren't particular discussions on transboundary impacts of pollution or any law and regulation that could make one pay for the suffering of the other, because they were responsible for it. So these arbitrations led for a way for those future conventions that we studied to be actually discussed and implemented. Bisma, do you want to go next?
No, I just wanted to add that we actually also picked Eamon to speak from our group. I think we can like expand on the harm principle,
Okay,
which was the basis of the arbitration. So Eamon could elaborate on that, I guess.
go ahead. Go ahead. Anna.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so basically, the harm principle is about how the actions of individuals should be limited and restrained only to prevent harm to the other individuals. Also, at the said site, lead and zinc were being processed, and the smoke from there damaged forests and crops in the vicinity. So the principle of the polluter pays was thus enforced to ensure sovereignty. This case also illustrated the ever-present battle between big businesses and capitalist corporations versus environmental protection. So that's all we've got.
Great. Paul, आपके ग्रुप से कौन बोल रहा है?
I think Eamon was supposed to speak. Eamon, are you there?
Yes. Yes, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I'll be talking about the Convention for the Prevention of Marine Pollution by Dumping of Wastes and Other Matter. So this convention is one of like the first global conventions brought into effect to protect the marine environment from human activities. It was formulated in 1972 in London, but it took like 3 more years for it to come into effect. It was brought into effect in 1975. So like its objective is to tackle the massive problem of air pollution and to promote effective control of all sources of marine pollution. It covers the disposal at sea of wastes and of other matter from vessels, aircraft, and platforms. Platforms are the oil drilling platforms that sometimes release toxic waste materials into the sea. These wastes are liable for creating hazards to human health, harming living resources and marine life. That's why it's really important to address them. And the convention works to take practical steps to prevent pollution of the sea by dumping of wastes. It does this so by controlling pollution of the sea by dumping and by encouraging formation of regional agreements that are supplementary to the main convention in itself. And also the 1972 convention extends the scope over all marine waters other than the internal waters of the member states. And it requires like a special permit for the dumping of identified materials and a prior general permit for wastes that are not identified, but they're still hazardous to the sea. This agreement was renewed in 1996, and currently there are about 87 states that are party to this convention, and Pakistan is one of them.
Pakistan's a party to everything. Rafe,
Yeah.
I think Red, they were going to talk about Red. Who's going to speak on this?
Yes, Assalamualaikum. A group about red. Yes.
Yeah. So basically, guys, we were assigned the RED program. It was first discussed in 2005 as a collaborative program that was to be carried out by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The RED program basically aimed to incentivize developing countries to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Later on, this program was further modified and was given the name RED++, especially after the Bali action. So RED++ was a climate change mitigation approach that was developed by the parties through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It basically deals with the conservation of forest carbon stocks, sustainable management of forest, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks, along with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The program has expanded steadily since its establishment, and now has over like 60 official partner countries spanning Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America. So this basically portrays that RED++ is an effective, efficient, and equitable mechanism for reducing emissions from deforestation and particularly forest degradation. So that was pretty much from it.
Okay, so the idea of bringing in reforestation, right? Or stopping deforestation. And I think a classic example, and we shouldn't miss the one good example that has come out of Pakistan, is the Clean and Green Initiative, or the Billion Tree Tsunami, or the reforestation of our forests. Some people argue about that too, but I personally think that it's a brilliant project that's been established in Pakistan. Yes, Rafe.
Ma'am, लेकिन that's besides that, जो RED initiative itself that was only focused on mitigating the effects of carbon emissions from deforestation. There was no afforestation plan in it.
Yeah,
This is
but
my
I think it's grown up a little bit. The same, because if you look at it now, sometimes what the developed world does is that they do the reforestation program in the developing world, as a part of the developing cooperation, and it's kind of reforestation. I mean, whatever you call it, if they're emitting here, they're curbing the pollution in the developing country by financing a forest, right? Or financing reforestation. So I think there are multiple means of implementation, or MOI, that you would have seen. Is any group missing? Everyone has presented, right? Raise your hands if you haven't, if I missed your group. Hamad.
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So our group discussed the carbon crediting, and I would like to present on that. So what we discussed was that there is a certain limit under which the factories or countries can add pollutants to the environment, and if they cross that certain limit, they're fined for that. From what we found on the internet, per 1 metric ton of carbon, the price for 1 metric ton of the carbon, the price is $24. This was according to the stat that was on the internet for 2016. So basically, what happens is that because of that, trade also happens between the developed and the developing countries. So if developed countries emits more pollutants to the environment as compared to the developing country, then they trade off between each other for like the limit they exceeded. So this was all about we discussed about the carbon crediting. Thank you.
Thank you. So if everyone's done, I would like to go ahead with the presentation for today. Adeen, have I missed you guys?
Yes, ma'am. I was also part of the group which was supposed to discuss the carbon trading, and I just like to add that the idea was like introduced by a British economist, Arthur Cecil Pigou, and the main idea for it was that rather than attempting to reduce the carbon emissions, we like pay people to reduce what they already produce, to give a further incentive to them to reduce the total carbon emissions. And how the rest has been discussed by my groupmate, but I just like to add that the procedure to sell these carbon credits is that they are listed on the Chicago Climate Exchange, where the companies which require more credit are just buy from the companies which have some in their reserve which they can trade. That's it.
Super. Adeen, you want to speak?
It was just me who was speaking. Sorry, I didn't lower my hand.
Okay, so I think we can start with the presentation now because we have very little time. So today we will be learning the Sustainable Development Goals. And let me just... All right. So we discussed this last time. When was the Sustainable Development Goal proposed?
Ma'am, I think
Yeah.
I think 2018.
2017. Just a guess.
2000.
SDGs. So in the Paris Agreement, what did we do? We coined the term sustainable development in 1972. But in the Paris Agreement, we developed new goals. And remember, we spoke about Agenda 21 in the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, which was the first conference of its kind that happened in 1972. And we said that in that Agenda 21, an action plan with a time frame or a framework was set up. When I was doing my undergrad, I actually had to memorize these, which were called the Millennium Development Goals. During my study time, SDGs did not exist because until 2015, we had to achieve what we call the Millennium Development Goals. And they had similar kind of indicators, which I put in the slides that I already shared with you about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals with 169 indicators that were set by the world leadership for sustainable development in the planet. Anyways, because I missed this point, I thought I should reintroduce this. So just like the Agenda 21, there was an Agenda 2030 set, and the Agenda 2030 in the 2015 agreed on achieving 17 sustainable development goals, which had 169 indicators. So for example, if the goal is to end poverty, then one of the indicators could be people earning, poverty's definition could vary from a place to place, but let's say in Pakistan, it's a certain figure that they have to earn every day. Now, I don't know what it is for Pakistan, but let's say it's 100 rupees per day. If you're earning less, you're poor. So that would be one indicator. And that one indicator would be used to see whether we have achieved that indicator for the Sustainable Development Goal number 1. But what this agenda really wanted was to transform our world for sustainable development of this planet. And what we studied then was a connection between the society, economy, and environment, and at the core of it stood sustainable development. Now it was shifted towards 5 Ps, which meant that we, the people, are actually responsible for sustainable development, but we have to make sure that there is prosperity economically, technologically, that there are partnerships and cooperations between governments to achieve those, as well as peace. Because if you look at a lot of data, especially with reference to environment, you will see that areas of conflict, areas where that does not have peace or that have not achieved peace yet, their problems relating to the sustainable development goals would be more compared to places that have been able to achieve peace. And at the core of this would be sustaining our planet, which is keeping the ecosystems on planet Earth safe while we do all of that, while we partner to grow, while we achieve economic growth, while we achieve technological growth, while we achieve peace. We should not forget that this planet is our home and we are meant to take care of it. But we means the people. We means us, all of us who are responsible to take care of this planet, that is to transform it or to transform our world for sustainable development. So I think that these 5 Ps are kind of important and have emerged, and these are the sustainable development goals that came out of the Paris Agreement, or the world leadership agreed on achieving these. And most of the discussions that you see anywhere, whether that's science or social sciences, is around these goals. So even if you're talking about gender equality, you would refer to a specific sustainable development goals. And if you have time, or I would really encourage you to go to your LMS slides, the slides that say, in the readings for SDG, I've put sustainable development goals and indicators for all of these, whatever the UN has recommended. Most of them are there, and I also put the progress report because I was hoping that you would read it and you would come back and you would discuss it. But I've still put some examples for you there because I knew most of you may not have been able to look at it. But if you look back, look closely, if I give you a minute to just look at all of these goals, they are expansion of the Millennium Development Goals that I had studied, which were to be achieved by 2015. And past 2015, we expanded those. So it wasn't just about maternal health or child mortality or something. It was much broader. The scope was broader. And if you see, like, from poverty to hunger to good health, to quality education to gender equality, almost everything is covered into it. And oftentimes an issue sits at an intersection of a certain goal. For example, for me, let's say if I work in the area of water, there are at least 11 or 12 goals that directly relate to water. You know, whether that's Sustainable Development Goal number 6 that looks at clean water provision and sanitation, to the 16th, which talks about peace, so that transboundary water could be ensured, like it would be ensured that there's fair share or equal share, or whether it's about, let's say, renewable energy, then how do you use that water for harvesting renewable energy? Or whether it's about good health, then how do you make sure that the water that people drink is healthy enough for them to not get sick? So a lot of these goals, or a lot of these objectives that we have, they can be covered in different sustainable development goals. And that's why even the goals that would seem social to you are also actually in a way related to the science. So when you talk about sustainable cities, it is as much sociology or anthropology or culture or heritage as it is the biota, the biomes, the earth, or the trees, or the culture, or the biodiversity there. It's very much the human environment as well. So I think there are multiple sides of it, and we will try to touch upon them. But I would encourage you to take part in this discussion as much as you can. So the first goal is ending poverty in all its forms. And there are indicators now, unfortunately, because I wanted you to study it at home, I haven't put those indicators there, and there are too many of them. But those indicators basically tell you whether you have achieved those goals or not. And I'll not discuss this one because it's kind of going, if we look at the future goals, they're all related to poverty as well. Ashan, you have a point?
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
So basically, I think like the goal isn't like ignoring the underlying inequalities in the international system. Like we have our current world system is sort of like favoring the rich minority or sort of stuff like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, right? Generally, in the environmental sciences, one of the things that we're often taught is, where does the wealth stand? And we're always shown that glass, the funnel glass, where it says that the majority, that the 20% has most of the wealth. So there's a lot of inequality. Or similarly, when it comes to pollution, they say that actually the top 100 and something corporations produce more pollution compared to rest of the people in the funnel. So it's like narrowing down, and majority is being produced by the top something. So yes, there is inequality, not only in sharing resources and injustice, but this, I think the poverty here doesn't really refer to that level of course it does in the greater scheme of things, but it mostly refers to, you know, the simple things that we have in our life, that whether our neighbor is able to eat meals properly 3 times a day or not. You know, it's very basic things like, what is your minimum pay? Do women get to have jobs? Are there job opportunities? You know, very basic things that could make you not poor. So it's not really about the bigger picture, it's mostly about the smaller picture, which is bringing people out of the poverty line. And the definition of poverty could vary from country to country. So for example, if it's $1.25 per day in a certain place, maybe it cannot be the same in my village. I mean, That's we cannot define poverty on that basis here at all. But let's say if that was the indicator, then maybe most of the people in my village are poor, you know. But if and if the goal is to put them above that line, it means that everyone in my village needs to earn at least $1.25 a day and more than $30 a month. Yes, Hamad?
Yes, ma'am. Like,
Ma'am.
just I like to comment on the answer that you just mentioned. So I feel like it seems more like a wish instead of like a goals, because again it's not achievable for me. It's not a smart goal, to be honest, because countries are not penalizing for not acting them. Like, who will be like implementing this stuff, or like monitoring all this ke ye kar rahe hain ya nahi kar rahe bacche.
You know,
Countries.
Yeah, you know, we send our reports. Like I said, Pakistan sends its reports. And from the 2018 report...
But is there any penalty for not acting on them?
Is there any penalty on us for not feeding the poor around us? No. I mean, what do we do?
Why will anyone do this? Like, if there's no any kind of penalty,
Because
or
the overall growth and the overall economy of the country would depend on healthy people and people who are not poor. So for example, poverty brings along with it a lot of other things, right? If there is social inequity and there is poverty, that would mean that, you know, if they will not have enough food. If they're malnourished, if they're not healthy individuals, they will not contribute to the economy as well as to the well-being of that one city. So, you know, whether that's a very nominal job or whether it's whatever it is, they have to be actively be contributing to the economy of a place. And if it's, I mean, it's why it's interdependent. So if the economy is better, more jobs would be provided. But otherwise, if there's poverty, if the kids are malnourished, if they don't even find food, their priorities would be different. And they would be not active enough to participate in the growth of the country. I think I mean, I would love to discuss this because I like discussion on areas like this, but I think it's a never ending debate. And the reason why these goals were set, and I would really encourage you to look at all the indicators for this goal and see which particular indicator can you achieve in your locality, or which particular indicator can Pakistan achieve in the next few years. And by in the next few years, I mean 2030, because we have to achieve these goals by 2030. And you know that I also consider these goals overambitious. But what is wrong with being overambitious? Because we have not done this before. I think it's about time that we become overambitious and put as much energy, money, and efforts as we can to it. Because, I mean, forget everything, forget the goals. This should be every individual's priority to make sure that people around them are not poor, right? They get to live under a roof and they have clean water. And
as humans, we always like self-interest. We always think about self-interest instead of developing as a community, right? So like, it's again idealistic, to be honest.
It's idealistic, but as
again expecting people to like contribute or like to like pay their role in development.
I mean, it's idealistic, but that's exactly why we are. We are here to discuss and think of ideal situations, and we are here to think that this is achievable, because this has been achieved by some countries. At least for most of their population, poverty has ended. Poverty is not a problem of some countries, let's say the Scandinavian countries, or places like Switzerland. I don't think poverty is such big of an issue for them. They have other problems of their own. But if other countries can achieve it, so can we. Actually, a lot of our principles derive on the fact that we're not supposed to accumulate wealth. We are supposed to share it. Our culture, our religion encourages us to do that, but do we really do it? And that has nothing, you know, you could say that Islam is very overambitious. Yes, it is, because it believed in equality. And by expecting for the rich to share the resources, by expecting for the leader to be equitable to everyone, to be socially just, is yes an overambition, but I don't think it's not achievable. Well, the population is increased.
Ma'am, the thing is, I have no problem with the goals. The idea is to like keep check and balance. The goal should be time bound instead of like making it like generic or like vague statement ke karna hai humne. It should be time bound so that it can be achieved and if some country is not like following up, so it should be penalized, so that one should like take it seriously instead of like just doing it बस करना है हमने एक protocol है और again it will definitely create a lack of data in the long run because ये data नहीं होगा और fake आ रही होंगे हमारे पास.
Well, I would like to go ahead on to goal number 2, but I would really like for this to be discussed on a separate, like past the class. If you're interested, we can discuss it. And those who want to discuss it, we can definitely discuss it. But these are all like the questions of morality and science, the questions of being objective and being emotional. I think they go hand in hand. Sometimes you have to bring compassion into science, and sometimes you have to bring compassion into economy, and sometimes you have to bring compassion into growth. Although otherwise you wouldn't expect that, right? And that is because we're trying to achieve these. And I don't think I always call them over ambitious because we're expecting for everyone to be not poor. That's not an easy task. But also it's not, countries have achieved it. So unless we don't want to achieve it, that would be the only reason for us to not achieve it. And kind of related to the goal number 1 is the fact that we have to end hunger and we have to achieve food security and we have to improve the nutrition of people because we want healthy individuals for a healthy planet, or a healthy planet can then produce a lot of healthy individuals. And oftentimes the concept of sustainable agriculture is brought into picture. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the concept of sustainable agriculture, but the industrialized agriculture, or this agriculture that we do very intensively, whether it's farming of animals or plants, where we put a lot of fertilizers, where we use a lot of pesticides to make sure that the environment is just ideal for growth of certain something. It could be a plant, and then for that process we even use biotechnology, we use seed variations that could increase the yield, but everything else is not really good for the environment. We are excessively using non-renewable resources, or we are relying on fossil fuels. All of those also increase air pollution. And similarly, if you've particularly looked at chicken farming, you must have heard a lot of people say that just stop eating chicken because it's full of hormones and it's full of artificial means of meat production. And to make sure that those animals are resistant to diseases, a lot of antibiotics are being fed to them, and a lot of injections are being given to them so that they could grow quickly. Sometimes, for example, my sister's research was looking at a similar thing, and she was saying that they're contained in one place, so they're not allowed to move in kind of a factory farming. So they become lazy. So they just sit in one place and eat, and then they accumulate more meat, and then you get to eat them. But that's not good, because the food that they're eating is full of growth hormones, and they're not walking. Whatever is happening in that restricted space, and that then impacts the health. So we are going to discuss this principle ahead, and I thought it would be a good idea to introduce it here, because in future Dr. Mahmood will be explaining the nature-based agriculture to you. But just for you to get an idea that the sustainable agriculture is very different from industrialized agriculture, and it has different names. It would come under different names such as agroforestry, whereas forestry is done alongside agriculture, organic agriculture, or organic farming, where you mostly rely on natural fertilizers for growth. Try not to use genetically modified seeds. Reduce your fossil fuel use. Try to reduce the supply chain. So you make sure that whatever is being produced is being consumed close to home, so that the emission of transportation and storage and many other things can be stopped. So industrialized agriculture is sometimes also focusing on export, but now the export standards have been set very high as well. So very often we end up having all of those industrialized farmed stuff, and a lot of organically produced food is actually being exported. And that has to do with the health of an individual and the environment. So food security, which is also something that comes along with agriculture, as well as fits into the sustainable goal number 2. We discussed this before, but I just put it in the slide. I think Aman was the one who explained why proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids are important for us, what's their function, and what are the sources. Of course, the sources are food that we get from animals and plants. And these nutrients are important because they have a particular function in our body. So iron is important because it's a part of hemoglobin that transports oxygen in our body, which is important for a healthy functioning of our body. But sustainable agriculture, leading to food security, leading to reduction of poverty, they're all again interlinked with one another. And I've been waiting for the right lecture to introduce this website that I absolutely adore, which is called Our World in Data. And all of those data that Dr. Mahmood was mentioning that exists on the FAO site, that exists on the WHO site, that exists on BP site, basically this website has brought all of that data into one platform, and it allows for you to play with certain things. So this was a world map from which I just extracted the results for Pakistan. So whatever data that we are sharing under the UN conventions to these respective organizations is being recorded. And that record is telling us that Pakistan has approximately like 20% of the population is undernourished. Now, you would think that 80% of the population is not undernourished, so it's a great sign. But when you think of numbers, out of the total population, that is like the arrow key, that refers to the number of people who are undernourished. And I think it's still a long way for us to go. And if we translate these percentages into numbers, we would realize how far behind we are in, how would we achieve those advanced goals if you're not able to achieve these basic goals such as food provision and provision of food that is nutritious enough for kids to grow healthy. But again, like I said, these things only get complicated and complicated, and we've looked at food, we've looked at agriculture. We know that agriculture utilizes most of the land that's present on this planet, but it has also a lot of other impacts. Now, why do people want for agriculture to be more sustainable? Why do people want for agriculture to be more close to nature? Is because it utilizes 70% of the water that is present on Earth. It is responsible for 26% of the GHG emissions around the globe. It is utilizing more than half of our land. It is responsible for eutrophication of our water bodies. So there are a lot of impacts that this industrialized agriculture resulted in, which is encouraged for us to shift our means and also make sure that these are sustainable. And why is this important? Like we said, 70% of the water that we utilize is actually going into agriculture. And yet people are hungry. And yet there's no food on people's plate. And water is essential for drinking. We need water very much for drinking, and it's important for our survival. But you know what's the percentage of water compared to the water that we eat? That water that we drink is only 0.01% of the water that we eat in the form of food, because 70% of water is going into production of food. So when I taught you hydrosphere, lithosphere, geosphere, think of how all of these resources are actually interlinked. So one particular website called it the water food environment dilemma, which means that the dilemma is that water is important, but actually most of the water is going into food production. And that's why the water that we're so worried about, which is the water that we drink, is only 0.01% of the water that we eat. So where do we shift our priorities when it comes to conservation of resources or conservation of hydrosphere resources or the water bodies that we have that's going into agriculture? And because we were onto this discussion, I thought it would be important to expand it further. We've discussed greenhouse gases, right? Gases that are responsible for warming of the planet. Generally, when you think about food, when you think about food waste, you don't think about them being responsible for the GHGs. But like we saw in the previous slide, that 26% of the global GHGs are emitted from the agriculture sector. And most of that is, so we eat, most of that comes from the food that we eat. So if you look at the graph below, it shows that some of it is supplied, lost in the supply chain. So while we're transporting it and the food goes off, that's when we release or some GHGs based on the food that's gone off. And some of it is people like us who buy extra, who buy what they don't need and end up throwing them into the bin, end up sending them to the landfills, and end up being producers of greenhouse gas emissions. Although this website says that it's 6%, there are also some websites or some studies that say that it's as much as 10% that's released. So that was one side of it, right? With the help of data that these big organizations or the same UN organizations or the same conventions that we discussed about have brought into light. But there's also another side to it, to agriculture in the field of environment, and that is environmental toxicology, which means that we bring in chemicals into the environment for agriculture or for the industrialized agriculture that we were talking about that have harmed the environment. And if Azhan and Paul know what this chemical is, yes, Hassan?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, ma'am, I wanted to ask that, for example, we have two SDGs. One is to eliminate the hunger and poverty, and one is to make the agriculture in a sustainable way. So, for example, if we adopt a sustainable agriculture practice and we use modern machinery tools for the agriculture, but it will impact the general farmers and their most of the people will get unemployed. They won't have the required expertise and skills to work into the lands. So won't that be a counterfactual? Won't that create a problem for the hunger, because people will ultimately be unemployed, and that would ultimately affect the poverty level in the future? So don't you think that it's a contradictory sort of goal?
Yeah. So when
do correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I think that's also another one of those problems that we face when we think of change and we think of changing the world. Now it's different for different areas, right? So for example, in most of the rural areas, it's actually the opposite. Everyone is getting educated, everyone is leaving their villages, everyone is going out, and that they lack resources. And by resources, I mean human resource. And that's why they would want for machinery to go there, and they would want for machinery to go and help them in agricultural production. But also, if there are big farmers who used to rely on a lot of help, how would that change? So if there is tech that's going to take the weed out for them itself, if there is a machine that's going to do most of the manual work for a farmer themselves, then yes, it's true that those particular people will go out. But remember that we said that we want more renewable energy to come in. So I think we have to think of those deals, the kind of Green New Deals that we talk about. That if we are saying that we need to reduce the fossil fuel ban, and there are more wind sites or solar sites being introduced, how do we trade off our manual labor or our human resource into that area? And I think that's exactly what the decision maker needs to think about. So for example, there's a discussion on introduction of law on electrical vehicles in Pakistan, right? So that is approved. But what about the charging of those vehicles? So it took us a lot of time to realize that we need to bring in electric vehicles, but we haven't yet thought about introducing a lot of renewable charging stations for those electrical vehicles. So let's say if I'm driving from here to Karachi and I don't have enough renewable resource form of energy or source of energy, then if I have to go and charge my electrical car using an electricity that came from fossil fuels, then who made this decision? How was this decision made? So oftentimes these decisions can be in conflict with one another, but that's why these goals are there. That's why there's the framework to want to change such that there's no compromise on those. And that's why you would see a lot of goals revolving around equity, justice, making sure that those who have less are taken care of, making sure that they get better job opportunities, cleaner job opportunities, health and safety. You've no idea how important the health and safety of every employer has become in the West. It would, I'm sure, eventually become important here. Especially those who work in difficult circumstances. They're given extra precaution, extra safety gears, and extra health gears to make sure that they don't suffer. but yeah, sometimes they can be in conflict with one another. So like I said, there is then another way of looking at things, which is that in industrialized agriculture, we often rely on chemicals. And this is an example of Bhopal, India, although I wanted to test Azhan, but he was...
मैम बता देता हूँ, like it's not like too difficult for me.
Okay, tell me what it is.
But I'm not sure, like I'm guessing it right now. So
Okay.
like
Make a guess.
the group data we have is methyl isocyanate, and probably it will be polyurethane, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so basically methyl isocyanate was used to produce this pesticide, which is called carbaryl. And that resulted in a disaster in India. It's called Bhopal disaster. And the first time I looked at human images of this disaster in India, it upset me so much because this gas eventually formed a cloud of gases, which then had a lot of other gases with it, which included chlorine gases and hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide, etc. And then they resulted in a lot of, some of them were nerve gases, some of them resulted in different disabilities in the childbirth in future, vision impairments, and a lot of other problems happened precisely because of the fact that we were not environmentally responsible, and that all we were interested in is production of a pesticide without thinking of the long-term impacts of that pesticide on human life or on human environment. And this is just one of those classic examples where we are taught, we are reminded that we need to be mindful of every action that we take in this planet. So I just wanted to introduce it, and as Azhan said, it's a pesticide that's produced. Right, so this one I wouldn't go into a great detail because we have 17 goals to cover in 15 minutes. But what I will, and again, the health, the well-being at all ages. So generally we only think of the youth and we never think of the senior citizens. So this realization that all age, people in every age are important, and that you're never really a problem at any age for us, and that it's our responsibility to take care of the well-being of every individual on this planet, was the Sustainable Development Goal number 13. It has a lot of health-related things, whether that's maternal health, child health, girl-child health. So wherever we face more issues, that's where this is focused towards. And again, I've put just one case study because I thought by this time we would have discussed a lot, but we haven't. But this was a medicine that was introduced. And again, this falls in the category of environmental toxicology or environmental chemistry, where a medicine was brought and it was a sedative, and it had antiemetic properties, which meant that a lot of pregnant women used to take it. And this wasn't properly tested. It was actually tested on rats, and it had negative implications on the embryo of women, or the teratogen problem. So later, when a lot of pregnant women took it, and when children were born without limbs and without legs, did people realize that it actually had a very negative health impact. So I think what I wanted to discuss about here is, generally we just talk about the human health, of how we look, of the diseases that we acquire, of any problem that we have because if we eat excess sugar or we do not eat healthy. But we kind of tend to ignore these extra luxuries or unnecessary necessities that we have had for ourselves, and one of them is medicine. I avoid medicine as much as I can, but I know of people who would, just because they think they're going to have headache, would take a medicine and just understand that it is a chemical. And we don't know how most of these chemicals are tested. Although now there's very strict protocols on vaccines and medicines being approved, but there is then another angle to it, which is that the environmental ethics side of it discourages its testing on any animals at all, which means that you have to test it such that no animal is harmed. And that's why a lot of products would now say that animals are not harmed, which means that you have to then question of how authentic that medicine is actually going to be on your body, and what impacts could it create, and how are the tests being carried if they're not being carried on animals. The fourth one is education. and equitable education and quality education, making sure I wouldn't want a discussion on the single curriculum in Pakistan on this, but I think this is also another area where we could have had some interesting discussions. If we have time, we'll get back to this. The fifth one is achieving gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls. So if someone from the social sciences wants to talk about this, because you know that we often say that climate change impacts women more than it does men, and that the disasters have higher impact on women, etc., etc. So if anyone other than people who've already spoken in the class want to talk, please raise your hands. And this goal, yes, Eamon.
So we were being introduced to this concept in literature of ecofeminism, which is basically how the environment is, how patriarchy is basically repressing not only just women, but also the environment. So I feel like this is very relevant to this debate.
Yes, it is very relevant to this debate. And I think one thing that I wanted to mention then, because I knew there are people from social sciences who would be discussing this gender side of things, was the fact that before the 1992 conference, a huge conference of or Congress of Women had taken place in 1991 for a healthy planet, where women from 83 countries had gathered, and there were more than 1,500 women who decided for the objectives or the Millennium Development Goals to be more inclusive. And they were not happy with the Millennium Development Goals because they thought they were not inclusive enough, that they did not take care of, I'm not sure if you follow the social sides of things, but some, that quote about some animals are more equal than the other. It's not just a debate on gender. I think it's also a debate on intersectionality, that depending on which strata of poor and rich you belong to, poor men could also suffer more than rich women. And so a concept of intersectionality is being brought in. This is a more basic debate where we say women need to be a part of all discussions. Women need to be a part of all discussions relating to climate change, science, and not just as gender experts. Because I hate the fact that in water policies, you would just bring the gender experts. They are important because they would look at the gender sides of things, but why can't you bring a female technical expert to come and speak on water related issues? So there are like a lot of discussions that could take place in this area as well. But the only thing that I wanted to put forward here was the fact that it's not just gender, but it's also related to every other goal that we want to achieve. Now, a goal that's very close to my area of work, which is clean water and sanitation. Everyone should have access to clean water. Everyone should have access to hygienic conditions for sanitation, clean enough. And again, using the website that I just mentioned, where I would highly encourage you to go and look at the graphs and play with the graphs and look at Pakistan, and particularly look at your area of interest and see what is happening around the globe on this. So this is just a comparison of rural versus urban and the provision of clean drinking water. And if you see Pakistan's not doing very well, I think the only countries that are behind us are countries that face severe poverty or face some sort of crisis. And we are basically doing very poorly in managing to supply water safely to our rural and urban population. And I'm not sure in how much detail can I discuss this right now, but I asked you to read a report which I had shared with you in the discussion on hydrosphere about why treatment of wastewater was important. And basically we said that there's a lot of fresh water present on Earth, but a very small percentage is available for us. And out of that small percentage, whatever water we use, sometimes, even though it's wastewater, 99% of it is still water. And that's why a lot of scientists are going towards reclaiming that 99% water and taking those 1% germs, chemicals, etc. out of it, and making sure that we have that 99% water, which is originally water, for agriculture or drinking based on what technologies we use. So that report that I shared with you, which was my work with the Jordan refugee campsite, used two technologies. Yes, Hamza?
Yes, ma'am. Like I went through your report of Jordan wastewater management. Like it was like you did an analysis report on the design and its efficiency. A water waste management site had been created next to a refugee camp, and like you collected data and you did some analysis, and in the end you like proposed what could be done to make it function even better.
Yes, that's exactly what I did. And so these two are basically, one is a very not very advanced form of treatment for wastewater, which is called trickling filter. It's basically as simple as putting certain media. And you know, when we saw the sands and gravels, and we used to filter water from it to make sure that whatever suspended particle was present in water could filter through. This is kind of the same principle, where you provide a medium and you let wastewater pass through it, and bacteria that are present there um, uh, grow there in aerobic, that is in the presence of oxygen, or anaerobic, which is in the absence of oxygen. They grow there to degrade whatever chemicals which are biologically oxygen demanding or chemically oxygen demanding, which is also something we discussed in the hydrosphere. They try to degrade them here, and we expect that whatever water, so the flux has to be maintained, right? Or the flow has to be maintained. So if I'm putting in a lot of wastewater, this particular form of treatment would not be able to clean it. So I have to let it run at a speed where water slowly percolates, the bacteria is allowed to react with it, and then a relatively cleaner water comes out at the outlet. Now, membrane filtration is quite fair, plain, and simple, which is the smaller the pore size, the cleaner the water that would be on the other side. This membrane was a microfiltration membrane, which meant it only stopped microorganisms until bacteria. So it's not able to stop viruses, but it takes most of the suspended solids and pathogens, especially bacteria, out. So I will just move on to the next goal. There are a lot of computer scientists, like a couple of electrical engineers, some physicists. I am sure that at least Hassan, I know, is working on solar energy, right? So the goal of this particular goal is to achieve affordable and clean energy, and the same clean energy that we've been mentioning on and off. Now, what is that clean energy? Generally, it is just the energy that's coming from renewable sources, which is the solar energy, the wind energy, the tidal energy, or the hydropower, or the energy from the dams. And it would be unhealthy, unclean if it's the non-renewable resource. Some are kind of debatable, such as nuclear, where the waste can be a hazard. But other than that, you know, it provides a lot of energy instantly. And again, diving into our world in data, if you look at this particular graph, this shows you, so we said there are non-renewable resources of energy. There's gas, there's oil, there's coal. And the data until 2019 shows you that if you look until the early 1900s, you would see that most of the energy came from coal. But it resulted in the environmental or the air pollution that it resulted in. And now you would see that the gas has taken over oil and coal, because both oil and coal gave us issues like oil spills in transportation, or more air pollutants. Coal also more air pollutants, unhealthy form of fuel. And that's why now a lot of focus is being shifted into gas, and you can see the scale of it. So the global fossil fuel consumption is at that terawatt hour, and tera is 10 raised to the power 12. So if you put that many zeros, that's the amount of gas that we're currently utilizing on the planet. And compared to that, now just compare the amount of fossil fuel that we're using to the amount of renewable fuels that we're using, which is hydro takes over because of some dams that have been built, but it's still nowhere near the fossil fuels that we're utilizing. So yes, the use of renewable resources in the form of wind, solar, and water potential is increasing, but it's still nowhere near the fossil fuel as the means to get our energy. And this was just, again, for you to encourage you to go back and look at the Our World data website. it shows you that how the number of oil spills have actually come down, but they haven't been completely eliminated. That this is still happening somewhere in some part of the world. And we spoke about elimination of poverty. It could only happen if there was decent work, if there was economic growth in an area, and if it was productive, if the work was decent. So if you have like a lot of labor working for you cheap and they're not getting paid enough, and their jobs are not safe for them, if they're prone to falling, if they're prone to accidents, then we're not really improving the decent work growth environment. And again, we spoke about, we've spoken about this, about how do we need to build resilient infrastructure that could save us from climate change or could adapt to climate change. But a lot of focus in the 21st century has been put on innovation. You see all of these startups, you see all of these tech, sometimes working with the industry, sometimes without, trying to innovate things continuously. And I think they're going to take a big scale in future because the infrastructure has become important. And again, the word inclusive comes in. Sometimes, infrastructures don't have to be always very big tech infrastructures. Sometimes it's as simple as putting a chair somewhere. For example, a few Spanish architects put together some green spaces in the extra space that was close to roads and put some chairs there. And slowly they could see those smaller habitats turn into public spaces for people who had otherwise nowhere to go. So let's say they're just sitting there thinking what they want to do. Let's say they're just having a sandwich, a quick sandwich. Let's say they're having coffee. Those green spaces, which were prepared on very small side skirts of the road, became very inclusive, happy, happening space in the city. So sometimes it could also be that. So it's not just high-tech innovation. Now I'm going to invite someone from the computer or the electrical or the physics department to tell me what is e-waste and have they ever read about e-waste and are they aware of the environmental and health impacts? And they could, of course, make use of this slide, but because we don't have time, I just want someone to come in as quickly as possible. So one thing while someone raises their hand, I could say is that there's a lot of plastic in a lot of these e-gadgets. And plastic is something that I, for example, work on. So if there's a lot of dioxins, if they're burnt, then dioxins are being released, especially if you want to take the copper out of the wire, which is what most of the people do. There's a lot of dioxins being emitted into the environment. So that's a problem. Plastic in itself is a problem. Burning plastic is a problem. So that's one problem that I identified. Now Hassan has raised his hand, so he's going to tell us more.
This is just going to be brief, but plastics is definitely one of the things. But the other thing is that older technology never realized that we're going to need such scales of sustainable development later on. So a lot of these technologies were made in such a way that they will not be able to recover it later on. So right now we do have a push towards technology that you can recycle from them, but still there are a lot of companies that just find it not economically beneficial, and they would rather just have more e-waste be collected, and some of it is not even regulated.
Yeah. So if you look at all of those circuit boards, all of these rods, these tubes, I'm not aware of most of this, but like when we studied it, we were told that a lot of arsenic, a lot of barium, a lot of lead is being released from them. And we know they're not good for the environment. So most of those technologies, as Hassan said, had negative implications on the environment. It was slowly being realized. Some of this has been solved, but some of this still exists. So if you are someone who works in this area, who researches in this area, I would encourage you to just go back and think about the gadgets that you have. Think about what do they have inside them. How are the current computers, let's say the newest MacBook that you have, different in terms of e-waste compared to a laptop that our fathers had. So why have they become lighter? What has changed? And how have the material become environment friendly? Please do think about them. So one of the goals is to reduce inequality. The other is to make sure that cities are safe, inclusive, resilient. Consumption, I always say this, always look for what you're producing, always look for what you're consuming, because that really stands at the core of our action. Climate action, Greta Thunberg, full stop. If you're following her her quest, then that's all of her campaign in one goal. The ability to stand up and speak and want decision makers to take radical change. That young girl made her environment minister resign because he wasn't taking enough actions for the environment. And this was when I had gone for my PhD, and I used to see it in the news and just think, oh, this is just another action. But how quickly has that movement evolved to become the kind of global movement that it is? I think it's incredible. But more than that, it is for everyone, for people like us, for an electrical engineer as much as me to think about what could we do to combat climate change. Is it just deforestation? No, it's not, because that's going to need more water. Then what is it? Is it innovation in the tech? It could not be only just that. Is it reduction of poverty? How do we reduce inequality? How do we reduce those intersectionalities or environmental intersectionalities that we were talking about, where the poor and the downtrodden would be affected more due to a disaster? So someone at the outskirt of Ravi would be affected more by a Ravi flood or by a Ravi drought compared to people who are sitting in DHA. So thinking of all those things, for thinking of everyone, and then thinking of the necessary actions for that. Or the same thing that Azan said, that how do we ensure that we are taking actions through action, through goals like these, where we stand up and hold people accountable. Not only is it from top to bottom, but also a bottom up approach. This is something that I kind of want to discuss in the microplastic pollution as well. So I will just leave it here that we've generally discussed how trash, chemical waste, dumping of marine pollutants that we just discussed in the beginning is impacting life below water. And life below water, like I said, is another area. It's a whole universe in itself. And we are implicating it. There are a lot of implications that our actions have on them. And we need to make sure through this goal that we are saving it. And there are a lot of global champions in this goal as well, if you read this or if you follow the news. So protect our ecosystem, terrestrial, forestry, and then that would stop biodiversity loss. So all of those things that we've studied in all the spheres are kind of interlinked and are covered in all the goals that we study. And why is peace important? Like I said, most of the issues exist in area where there is disputes, there's crisis. So peace is important, and justice is important, and inclusivity at all levels is important. Cooperation between institutions, cooperation between countries is important. And of course, that peace needs to be regional, national, and global, and not just for one particular area. And finally, we've set all these goals. And when we set all these goals, we have to make sure that we actually are able to implement it. So this 17th goal is kind of talking about the systemic changes, the changes in the way institutions work, the changes in the way in which global partnership can be improved to make sure that we actually achieve these goals. And I think I will end here and let you go back and think about it. And please, if you go back in the next class, although we will be studying environmental laws in Pakistan, please go back to the slides where I put all the indicators and think of which particular goal relates to you the most and which particular indicator could you improve as an individual. So for example, for me, the Sustainable Development Goal number 6 is my area. And one of the indicators is to improve, for example, for Pakistan, to improve its wastewater and achieve wastewater of up to 50%. and Pakistan's only currently treating 2% of its wastewater. So we have 48% more wastewater to treat until 2030. So again, that's an overambition, but how can I, as an individual, or LUMS or WIT as an institute, contribute to that? I think that would be my role when I go back home and think about it. So that's it. If you have any questions, please go ahead and ask it now. Or if you have any point, so some people raise their hands about a certain goal. If you have any point that you wanted to make during the presentation or any discussion that you wanted to carry, please let me know. Yes, Daniel.
I read somewhere that Pakistan has met its goals with regard to replantation of trees. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. We've met most of it, even for poverty. So if you look at the, I'll also upload the report of, or you can just go online and see the report that the SDG report that we gave. So there are like even more ways to find out how we've achieved these goals, right? So if you're interested, you can go and read the papers that I've uploaded. But the report that we sent kind of shows how we've achieved a certain indicator. And according to those reports, Pakistan's doing much better and reducing poverty. I think that's one goal that we're doing very good at in the reports. But most of the goals we are either going down or we're just saying static at one point. But yes, deforestation and that project in general, if you look at Follow World Economic Forum or other platforms, is taken as an example of how we are increasing green spaces or achieving our goals. So if we said a certain area were to be deforested, I think we've already done more than that. Is that it? Okay, guys, if you don't have any questions, then I would like to thank you. And I would really encourage you to go back and read. Otherwise, I would teach them again in the class if you don't read it yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. Allah Hafiz.
Allah Hafiz.